Good evening, everyone. It's Cam with Modern Retro Renaissance. Earlier today, I was flipping through the internet, browsing, and came up on a list of the best selling consoles ever. It was the top 28, which pretty much encompassed everything from the original Atari all the way up to modern consoles. And I'll be honest, I was kind of surprised by what I saw. And I had some thoughts on that and thought, what better opportunity to make a video to get these thoughts out than to talk about this? Something that I believe is near and dear to all gamers' hearts. Just seeing kind of how our favorite consoles did, maybe examining why the consoles did the way that they did, why they sold the way they sold. Just to break it down real quick, I'll start with Generation 3 because before then there really was no competition. It was Atari. You had your Magnavoxes, that type of thing, but really it was Atari before then. Starting with Generation 3, the NES sold 61.9 million systems, whereas the Sega Master System sold 13 million. Then Generation 4, Super Nintendo sold 49.1 million. Genesis sold 30.75 million, which is Sega's best-selling console ever. And just to throw it in there for a little bit of flavor, the TurboGrafx 16 sold a whopping 5.8 million systems. Going to Generation 5, this is where it starts to really get interesting. PlayStation 1 sold 102.49 million consoles, which is amazing, being that this is Sony's first foray into the console market, and it sold over 100 million units. The Saturn, and this number actually surprised me, only sold 9.26 million units. The Nintendo 64 sold 32.93 million. And just for my friend Joel with the Poor Man's Retro Game Room, the Atari Jaguar sold a bolstering huge number, 250,000 consoles sold. Generation 6, PlayStation 2 sold 55 million consoles. Xbox, Microsoft's first foray into the console market, sold only 24 million. That number actually seemed low to me. The GameCube, which for Nintendo purposes was a disappointment in sales, sold 21.74 million. And Sega's last console, the Dreamcast, which many of us remember very fondly, only sold 9.13 million. Generation 7, the Wii, which got your grandmother into gaming, sold 101.63 million. The PlayStation 3 sold 87.4 million, whereas the Xbox 360 came in a close third at 84.7 million. The Generation 7 numbers are definitely the closest when it comes to any sort of console race. Nintendo obviously ran away with it, selling 14 million more than Sony, but still it was very close, and a lot of systems sold during that generation. Last generation that we have figures for, these figures actually are still growing, especially for the Switch and the PlayStation 4. The Switch has sold to date 111.08 million. That number is definitely going up. PlayStation 4 has sold 116.9 million, and with PlayStation 5s being hard to get, PlayStation 4s are actually still selling fairly well, is my understanding. You have the Xbox One, which sold 51 million, and the redheaded stepchild of Nintendo consoles, the Wii U, sold 13.56 million consoles. Just kind of breaking down the top 10, it was interesting. Another surprising statistic: of the top 10, 5 of those were Sony systems, 4, unsurprisingly, were Nintendo systems, and 1, the Xbox 360, was a Microsoft product. It was also interesting to me that 6, maybe 7, depending on how you look at it, of the top selling systems ever were consoles, and 3 were handhelds, I say 6 or 7. Depends on how you look at the Wii. I consider the Wii, or the Wii, excuse me, the Switch. I consider the Switch a console. A lot of people consider it a hybrid system. I consider it a console that you can also undock and play on the go. Uh, Actually, love to hear your thoughts on the Nintendo Switch and what you consider it in the comments, because I know that that is something that is up for debate. A couple of surprises looking at the numbers. Number one surprise was the PlayStation Portable actually came in at number 10 on the all-time best-selling consoles. It actually sold 82 million, which was a half million more than the Game Boy Advance. Before looking at these figures, I never would have figured that. I would have thought the Game Boy Advance outsold the PSP hand over fist. Another really interesting and surprising statistic was that the PlayStation 1 did sell over 100 million consoles for Sony's first attempt at the console market. I think it speaks to the growth of video games as a hobby, going from the Super Nintendo generation to the PlayStation generation, and how it was becoming more widely accepted as a recreational activity, and the stigma was going away. Now to jump into our top 5 consoles ever. Number 5 may end up somewhere higher on this list. Number 5 being the Nintendo Switch. Number 5 and number 4, which I'll get to in a second, are my 2 favorite modern retro consoles. These 2 consoles make being a retro gamer in a modern world so easy. The Switch is so much fun if you like modern retro games. If you like retro games, if you like modern games, there's nothing that the Switch doesn't have something for you, no matter what kind of gamer you are. It's, like I said before, has sold 111.08 million consoles so far, and my guess is when it's all said and done, it's going to be pushing over 130 million, maybe even pushing towards that number 1 spot, because it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. Number 4, the other modern retro console of choice for me, the other one that until recently when I got my PS5 was the other console that I kept hooked up on the TV in the living room, the PlayStation 4. PlayStation 4 has sold 117.2 million consoles and counting. Like I said before, it is still selling fairly well. It is only, in my opinion, second to the Switch when it comes to modern retro gaming. There are so many wonderful games that harken back to the earlier generations of games that you can play on your PlayStation 4, and for the cheap, which is always good in my book. Number 3, which actually surprised me but should not have been any surprise to me, and the only handheld system on the top 5 list, is the Game Boy Color. I actually never owned a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color. During that time, I was lucky that I got a Super Nintendo and a Genesis. I wasn't even going to ask my parents for a third. Money was a little bit tight, and I knew that it was a little bit too frivolous for just asking my parents to expend that extra money. But the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color have sold 118.69 million consoles, and I think everybody knows why. I mean, the Game Boy, it had Tetris. That probably sold 2/3 of those systems by itself. Number 2, which was also a surprise to me, probably because I'd never thought about it very closely, is the Nintendo DS. The DS is actually the first handheld console that I ever owned, the first handheld console that I ever bought with my own money. The DS was a heck of a little system. It sold 154.02 million units. Part of that is because it had about 6 different versions. You had the DS, the DS Lite, the DSi, so many different versions, but it's just such a fun little handheld console, and it deserves to be where it's at. Actually, when I get to my number one, we may have a little bit of discussion, a little bit of debate. Number one, and most people will know this, is the Sony PlayStation 2. I actually will place an asterisk on the PlayStation 2 being the number one selling system at around 159 million units. And the reason I place an asterisk is the PlayStation 2 sold so many units because people were buying it as a DVD player, because you could buy the console, which was a DVD player, for just a little bit more than you would pay for a standalone DVD player. So a lot of people were buying this system that probably had very little, if any, intentions of playing a video game on it. They just wanted to watch DVDs, and this was the best option. It was a really good DVD player. Once again, there are a lot of things to dissect in looking at the best-selling consoles ever. You notice that none of the retro consoles really are on there except for the Game Boy Color, the Nintendo, the Genesis, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64. None of those are on there, and I think there's a reason for that, and that I'd hit on it a little bit earlier. That reason being that when the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo especially came out, it was still looked at as something that only nerds played. It was something that was a little bit taboo. Parents didn't understand what it was. Then you have 10, 15 years later, those people that grew up playing the NES and the Super Nintendo, they're now parents, and they understand about gaming. It has grown. It's become acceptable for everyone to play. You've got nerds playing. You've got jocks playing. You've got every type of person playing video games now. There is no stigma to playing a video game. Also, it was interesting that two of the most recent full generations, the 8th generation, showed up in the top 5, which lends itself to what I was just saying, that video games have evolved. Video games have become something greater than they were 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. They have become a part of the zeitgeist. It's just something that everyone accepts as something that's fun to do. Glad that we have gotten to this point. Once again, guys, I just wanted to kind of get my thoughts out there. Found this list very interesting. Found it surprising. Some of the things didn't surprise me. Some of those consoles that are on there were exactly what I would expect. I knew that they sold well. I knew that they were popular. I would love to hear your thoughts, though, guys. As always, I just appreciate you tuning in, hearing me rant and rave and talk about something that I love, which is video games. Whether it be modern, whether it be retro, just video games in general. Can't say enough about this hobby that I've been doing for almost 40 years now. Everybody, have a good night and game on.